So, I've already mentioned it once. See how well you were paying attention. What missionary have we been reading about? Misa? Huh? Well, he's the one we've been doing on Paul's study night, but what about the other missionary? Isaiah Bowser. Nope. All right, Zach. David Livingstone. Well, I guess you said David, so yes. Just, you got to get the last name in there too. So, David Livingstone. All right, now, does anybody remember the opening chapter? Now, I understand we're reaching back in here because I'm curious to think what's the answer, Mo? Go for it. Okay. So what happened? He got attacked by a lion. Mo, you and I are in sync, dude. All right. He knew where I was going. All right. In the very opening chapter, when we started with David Livingstone, it actually started with him in Africa being attacked by a lion. All right. After taking a couple of shots from the gun he had, I really wanted to know what the gun was. It never told me that part. So anyhow, the details that get left out of these books is just sad. Anyhow, okay. Now, let's see. This is a tough one. Does anybody remember what country David Livingstone grew up in? Maisie? Scotland. All right. Very good, young lady. What was his job as a kid? Does anybody remember that one? Okay, somebody besides Maisie who has obviously read this book before. Silas? Do you know? All right, Sam. Yeah, he did. And if a string broke, you had to tie it together real quick. All right, Maisie, what was it called? A cotton piecer. Yes. She looked down at notes like she's got this in her. I'm a little concerned about this here. It's a good thing we ain't doing candy tonight. All right. Now, leading into where our story picks up, all right, what was it that David Livingstone's father rejected? What was it that he was like, this is not okay? We go to the back corner to David. Science. He was not okay with science. But because he was so focused on the Bible that he didn't want to argue with the Bible from science. Elijah. Botany is a form of science. Botany is a science. It's part of science. So yes, in more specific, okay. David was reading a book last week on botany. But David Livingstone wanted to pursue all kinds of science, and his father was opposed because that was a lot of the spiritual focus of the day is, well, God made people. We shouldn't be worried about what's inside of people. We should just trust God, kind of thing. So today, we're going to pick up with David Livingstone again, chapter 3. All right. Science or religion? The choice had haunted David Livingstone for 8 years now. David wanted to become a Christian, but so many wonderful scientific discoveries were taking place in the world that it was hard for him to think of turning his back on them to give his life to God. David constantly puzzled over the dilemma before him until 1832, when a book came to his rescue, Philosophy of a Future State by Dr. Dick, was loaned to David by the Reverend Muir, pastor of the Congregational Church the Livingstone family attended. Although the title of this book did not sound exciting, the book's contents grabbed David's attention from the start. Dr. Dick was a thoroughly Christian man, and in the book, he argued that God was a scientific designer and that the diligent study of biology, botany, chemistry, and astronomy would draw the student closer to God. According to Dr. Dick, who was himself a famous Scottish astronomer, A person could pursue both God and science. The two could go together. David was stunned. This was exactly what he had thought, but he'd never found any evidence that others agreed with him. Now he was free to become a Christian without having to reject science and a knowledge of the natural world around him. After praying and asking God to guide his life, David was still a little unsure how to go about telling his father that he wanted to pursue science and that it wasn't an evil thing to know about the insides of the body or the reason why the stars crossed the night sky. Thankfully, something happened that changed David's father's mind. At church, the Reverend Muir read a long letter entitled "To the Churches of Britain and America on Behalf of China" to the congregation from Dr. Charles Gutzlaff. There we go. In the letter, Dr. Gutzlaff told of the tremendous need for missionaries in China and recommended medical training as the best kind of training for a missionary. As a doctor, a missionary could speak to the people about God while healing them physically. As David sat next to his father, listening to the letter being read aloud, his heart raced. Here was a missionary suggesting that a man get medical training, scientific training, before going to the mission field. Here, at last, was a reason why a Christian should learn about science. As the family walked the 3 miles home from church that morning, David and his father fell into step together. So, what did you think of Dr. Gutzlaff's letter? David asked nervously, afraid his father would disagree wholeheartedly with it. Fascinating, replied Mr. Livingstone. Perhaps I've been a little harsh in regard to learning about science. If science can open a Chinese man's heart to God, it must have some merit after all. David could hardly believe what he was hearing. Did his father mean it? He had to know. So, you wouldn't mind if I borrowed a few books about medicine to read? He asked, almost afraid of the answer. His father walked in silence for several minutes. No, lad, he finally said, and then added, but I don't know what good it will do you working in the mill and all. Mixed emotions surged through David. On the one hand, his father was giving him permission to pursue science, which he's been pursuing against his father's wishes. Anyhow, okay. On the other hand, it was true. He worked at the mill for 14 hours a day. He was 19 years old. He still lived at home. Nearly every penny he earned went towards paying rent for the family apartment and funding the 3 younger children's education. David only wished he could have the same chance at education as his younger siblings, but it was too late now. Still, somehow, he assured himself, he was going to become a medical missionary. When he told his grandfather of his plans, Grandpa Livingstone tried to sound enthusiastic. Deep down, though, David knew he was worried about any of his grandchildren leaving Blantyre. Grandpa Livingstone had 5 sons. 3 of them had gone off to fight in the Napoleonic Wars and had never returned. A 4th son, a clerk in Glasgow, had been captured by a press gang and taken aboard a British Navy ship where he'd been forced to work until he died on board several months later when the ship was in the Mediterranean Sea. Neil Livingstone, David's father, was the only one of the 5 sons left alive. Grandpa Livingstone had good reason to fear for his grandchildren leaving the village where they had been born and raised. Still, the more David thought and prayed about it, the more he felt God was calling him to be a medical missionary. As outrageous as it seemed, the idea would not go away. David discussed it with his pastor and his parents. Although they all thought he had the intelligence to be a doctor and the determination and faith to be a missionary, all 3 of them shook their heads and told David there was no practical way it would happen. David, however, would not give up. The tiny seed that had been planted in him when he first heard Dr. Gutzoff's letter had grown within him. David knew he would burst if he did not find a way to go to medical school. Couple of questions real quick. What changed Mr. Livingstone's mind about science? Elijah? Okay. The possibility, he hears, Mr. Livingstone hears the possibility of using medicine as a way to get into China and do something for God. So he sees this, and he sees a possibility. So it gets him thinking, all right? What country was looking for medical missionaries? Mo? China. China was looking for medical missionaries. Now, where was Mr. Livingstone in the first chapter? No, in the very, very first chapter, when he gets attacked by the lion. Yes, he was in Africa. So he was in Africa, or that's where we know he's going to end up. So what's this whole deal with China? What's going to happen? Now, do you think he can go to college? He works 14 hours a day to help the family pay rent. How's he supposed to raise the money for college? Huh? There's another 10 hours. There you go. There's another 10 hours. Well, let's see. All right. One night, David sat on his bed in the family's one-room apartment while his sisters, Janet and Agnes, sat at the table. 13-year-old Janet was playing school teacher, quizzing 8-year-old Agnes on English grammar rules. I don't like his sister. For a test at school the next day, okay? As the two girls worked away, David wrote some numbers on a scrap of paper. He looked at them. 12 pounds. It would cost 12 pounds to attend Anderson College in Glasgow for one term. Anderson College was the least expensive college David had been able to find that offered courses in basic medicine. David would need another 12 pounds for lodging, food, and books. The numbers he had written down revealed the depressing truth. David now made 5 shillings a week. Now he's been upgraded to a spinner in the mill, working as a spinner in the mill. Since there were 20 shillings in a pound, he earned 1 pound a month. He ran his hands over his face. If he saved every penny he earned, it would take him an entire year to have enough money to pay for one term of college. But of course, he couldn't do that. He had to buy his clothes, help pay for rent, and Charles and Janet and Agnes' schooling. On top of that, he was helping to buy food for the family, and he gave generously to his church. He jotted down some more calculations. 3 years. If he saved every penny he could, in 3 years, he would have enough money saved to attend medical school for one term. But then he would be 23 years old. That's not old, by the way. David looked up from his calculations. They were not discouraging. Rather, they gave him hope. It could be done. It might take a while, but with some determination and hard work, he would go to medical school and then on to China as a missionary. He had made up his mind. Nothing was going to stop him now. When David told his parents of his plans, they doubted he could save that much money. Surely, they argued, he would change his mind before 3 years were up. Some girl would come along, and like his older brother John, he would settle down with a wife and raise a family right here in Blantyre. But David was determined. And in November of 1836, he had finally saved enough money to go to Anderson College. Not only that, He had not had a single girlfriend in the entire 3 years, for fear of temptation to get married would stop him from reaching his goal. Now, understand, it's a little comical. We start laughing, but folks, this is sacrifice and dedication for the work of God. He was determined nothing was going to stop him. So he set that as an absolute priority and set everything else aside and said, I'm not going to take that risk because nothing is more important. All right. Nothing would stop him from reaching his goal. All right. It was a cold, snowy morning when David and his father set out together on the 8-mile walk to Glasgow. Between them, they carried everything David would need for 5 months. Okay. We don't have any of our high schoolers about to go to college here, do we? Okay. Anyhow, imagine this for your college packing. All right. A change of clothes, several hand-sewn notebooks, a plate and a cup, a bone spoon, and a woolen blanket. In his pocket, David had 20 pounds and the addresses of some cheap boarding houses where a friend had told him he might be able to rent a room. He leaves home, one change of clothing, a plate, a spoon, and notebooks. Okay? After over 2 hours of walking, David and his father reached the outskirts of Glasgow, marked by row upon row of dreary red brick tenement houses, stretching as far as the eye could see. It was unlike anything David had experienced. In Blantyre, it was unlike anything David had experienced in Blantyre. And for a while, he walked alongside his father, silent and wide-eyed. Together, they trudged from one address to the next. But even the cheapest boarding houses were too expensive for David. Finally, one landlady told David that if he could afford to pay 2 shillings a week for a room, there was only one place in Glasgow for him: Rotten Row. Rotten Row certainly did not sound like an appealing place to live. But David and his father followed the landlady's direction and soon found themselves standing in front of a dilapidated wooden building. Several babies were crying loudly inside, and a woman was yelling at the top of her voice. David knocked gingerly on the well-worn door. "It's not locked," came a reply from inside. David turned the knob, and he and his father entered a dingy, candle-lit hallway. "Well, what is it you'd be wanting then?" asked a stout, older woman with a dirty apron tied around her waist. "Do you have a room I could rent?" asked David, looking around the dusty hallway. "I only have one," replied the woman. "Upstairs, second on the right. It has a bed and a chair in it. The bathroom's out the back door. I'll give you a cupboard in the kitchen to keep your food. Now, how does that sound for 2 shillings a week, eh? A bargain, I'd say." David sighed. Even without seeing the bedroom, he knew it was hardly a bargain. But it was a roof over his head and a place to keep his books. "I'll take it," he said. "That'll be 4 shillings, said the woman shrewdly. 2 for the first week's rent and 2 for a deposit. "I'll put my things upstairs and bring the money." It didn't say David sighed. I sighed for David. Okay, that's a little bit of license there. Okay, "I'll put my things upstairs and bring the money down in a moment," said David, picking up his bag and reading and heading for the stairs. The room was every bit as bad as he imagined it would be. Mold grew on the inside of the walls. There wasn't enough space in the room for David and his father to step inside and shut the door. It took only a moment for David to put his things away. "Well, God bless you, lad," said Mr. Livingstone. I'm sorry, I can just picture this, okay? "You know we'll do whatever we can for you, and we want you to come home whenever you can spare the time." With that, He shook his son's hand and began to walk back to Blantyre. David stood on the doorstep and watched his father disappear around the corner of the building. For the first time in his life, 23-year-old David Livingstone felt completely alone. He'd never spent a single night away from home before. He'd always had his brothers and sisters and parents and grandparents around him. For a brief moment, he wanted to run after his father. But he had worked and saved for medical school too long to turn back now. Impossible as it was to believe, the bed in David's tiny room was even more uncomfortable than it looked. And David was glad to climb out of it early the following morning. A big day lay ahead of him. By mail, he had enrolled in chemistry, medical, Greek, and religion classes. But now it was time to meet his professors and fellow students. David would never forget his first weeks of study at Anderson College. He woke up every morning with the excitement of going on a new adventure, an adventure in learning. Until now, all of his schooling had been done after a long day of work at the mill. Now, he could study in the morning and afternoon when his mind was fresh. What a change it was to be able to read and take notes without forcing himself to stay awake. He had read his textbooks through from cover to cover long before his professors were finished introducing their courses. And he stayed long after class, debating what he had learned with the other students. For the first time, David felt he was mixing with people who valued learning as much as he did. Most of David's fellow students had attended the best schools in England in preparation for college. Their fathers were paying for their tuition at Anderson College. Despite the fact that David came from a low social class, the other students quickly accepted him as a fellow student. His interest and enthusiasm more than made up for his lack of a correct social background. The whole college atmosphere made David feel more alive than he had felt his entire life. Despite his living conditions at Rotten Row and the nights when he had nothing more to eat than a bowl of cold porridge, the new version of that is ramen, okay? Anyhow, he never doubted he was in the right place. Of course, it helped that Anderson College buzzed with the latest scientific discoveries, especially in the new area of electricity. Two of the senior students had constructed a galvanic battery. Yes, I said that right. Galvanic battery, and now it had enough current to perform a number of electrical experiments. While all this interested David, the thing that fascinated him the most was learning to treat sickness. David had never lost sight of his goal of being a missionary to China. He took notes in class on all of the latest medical techniques, 1836, such as how long to bloodlet a person for varying illnesses, the exact number of leeches to use to suck blood, and the quickest way to amputate an injured person's limb. He also learned how to use the new gadget called a stethoscope, which allowed a doctor for the first time to hear air and blood flowing inside the human body. All these new advances fascinated David's family too. Mr. Livingstone had changed his mind completely about science and religion being incompatible now that he realized that science could help spread the gospel message. He was eager to hear about all David was learning, and so was the rest of the family. Once a month, David would make the 16-mile round trip home to Blantyre, where his father would throw an extra log on the fire and his mother would brew a large pot of tea as the entire family gathered around to listen with rapt attention as he described life in Glasgow and the wonders of medical science. Wow. Okay, these conversations fired David's younger brothers and sisters' imaginations and opened their minds to other possibilities besides working in the mills. His sisters, Janet and Agnes, decided to work hard to become school teachers, while Charles made up his mind to study and become a pastor. In April 1837, 5 months after arriving in Glasgow, David had completed his first term at college. He had also run out of money, and so he left his room on Rotten Row and returned to Blantyre to work in the cotton mill, and save more money so he could go back to college the following November. It felt strange to David to be back working in the mill after mixing with such well-educated people all winter. While his hands worked the loom, David thought about the new courses he planned to take during the next term at Anderson College. Even though David worked hard and saved every penny he could, when it came time to return to college, he didn't have enough to go back. But before he could despair, his older brother John, who now had a respectable job as a lace merchant, offered to give David the money he needed. It was the old Scottish way. David had helped his younger siblings, and now he was receiving help from his older brother when he needed it most. He was truly grateful. David's next term at college was just as exciting as his first. David had a mind like a sponge, and he wanted to learn all he could about everything. He made friends with his professor's assistant named James Young. James had been hired to make scientific equipment to use for experiments, and David was fascinated by his workshop. James taught David how to use a lathe to turn wood and a furnace to heat glass and metal. David also learned how to mend broken or damaged pieces of science equipment. After all, David reasoned, since he had no way of predicting what he would be called upon to do once he was a missionary in China, he wanted to learn as much as possible. Couple of questions here. How many years did David figure he was going to have to work to pay for his first semester of college? Noah? 3 years. 3 years of 14-hour days to save up enough money to go to college. That's a lot of work for one purpose, one goal. What college did he go to? What was the name of it? Anybody catch the name? Mr. Richard. Anderson College. When it came time for the second semester, how did he manage? Where'd the money come from for the second semester? Silas? His older brother. Silas latched onto that older brother paying for things. I can see that. All right. So, we're going to look at a verse to close things out. I had thought about going to chapter 4, but we need to keep moving tonight. I wasn't sure how long that would take. All right, Proverbs chapter 3. Turn with me there real quick. Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, Job, Psalms. Proverbs chapter 3. Well, come on. Chapter 3 and verse 6. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make straight your paths. Be not wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord. Turn away from evil. It will be healing to your flesh and refreshment to your bones. I should have got verse 5 in there. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Do not lean to your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make straight your paths. We're going to watch or read, in my mind, I'm going to watch David Livingstone and see how God directs and moves him. What is his goal right now? Elijah? Missionary to China. All right. He has a goal. He's had it for a while now. Missionary to China. That's where I'm going. And yet we know that he ends up in Africa. How's he end up there? We'll have to read that and find out. Things are going to happen, and God is going to direct him. But David has made a purpose. This is what I'm doing. I'm going to do this, and he's trusting God to get it done. He's working hard. He's doing his part, but he's trusting God to get it done. In all your ways, acknowledge him. He will make your paths, make straight your paths. God's going to lead us. He doesn't want us to flounder around and wonder what we're supposed to do. God will lead us. We just have to be willing to follow his path. All right? Any questions about Mr. David Livingstone tonight? Okay. Now, it's going to be a couple of weeks before we come back to this, because we did it 1 week early, so it'll be 5 weeks before we get back to this, but we will get back to Mr. David Livingstone. Please, church, remember to be praying for the Rasmussens this week and their family Bible school thing they've got going on. All right? In just a second, I'm going to, yes. Yes. There we go. Very good. Good deal. It is still possible. I was not nearly as dedicated before I got to college. I just ended up with a lot of debt and then spent 4 years working hard to pay off that debt. So I paid it on the backside. But interesting, brief story. You got me started, so it's your fault. It's Miss Barb's fault. Okay, we'll blame it on her. When Heather and I got out of college, when we got done, Bob Jones University, we graduated. Both of us had our degree, and we knew we had to have all of our debt paid off before we could start our deputation. There was some weird tax stuff with using current contributions to pay for past debt and things that we had to be sure we avoided. And so it was going to take a lot. Aircraft maintenance, missionary aviation is not cheap. You spend a good bit extra. So I had poor Heather kind of married into debt when she married me. She had some of her own, but she had been a little more careful than I had. So we had a chunk of debt. And when we got married, we said, all right, God, I called all of our loan companies because they were scheduled out for like 20 years. I called all of our loan companies. I said, all right, what do I have to pay on this loan every month in order to have it paid off in 4 years? And every single one of them laughed. I said, no, I'm serious. Give me the number. And they're like, click, 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 click. There's your figure. Thank you very much, sir. And we started praying. God, we can live off of my income, but Heather needs a job that will make exactly this amount of money, so every month we can do this and we can pay this off in 4 years flat. And God gave her a job making that exact amount of money. And for the next 4 years, her paychecks came in all month, and at the end of the month, they all left. But in 4 years, actually 3.5, because we got an extra chunk in the middle from somebody. 3.5 years, our entire enormous college debt was gone because God provided. God's good. God will pay for what God asks for. So, very good. You got to work for it because believe me, she didn't make that money just, sitting at home. All right? There was a lot of work to be done, but God provided. He always will. All right. Any other quick questions before we close out? We are going to take just a few minutes of break. I'll close in prayer. We'll take a few minutes of break, and then we will go into our business meeting. Again, folks, our business meetings, we are here to share some information with you, and should be quick, painless, easy, and some fun stuff that God has done. All right? Actually, Mr. Gary, would you close in prayer tonight? Amen.